Welcome to Immaculate Deception Part 3. The cause and cure of childbed fever was not discovered until the 19th century by Ignaz Semmelweis, a Viennese physician who challenged the general belief that the weather had somehow contributed to the spread of the disease. Semmelweis observed that in his own hospital in Vienna, the mortality rate of birthing women in the first division, a section run by doctors and medical students, was 3 times the mortality rate of the second division, which was run by midwives and nuns. He noted no differences in the kinds of patients treated in either section, as birthing women were admitted on alternative days to each division. He did observe that women in the first division were as frightened of the doctors as they were of childbirth, and he wrote later that these women believed that the doctor's interference was always the precursor of death. And they were right. It was not only the doctor's unwashed, germ-laden hands that carried the disease of childbed fever from cadaver to laboring woman, but also the aggressive practice of inserting his hands inside the birth canal, an interference in normal birth that midwives shunned. Under Semmelweis's authority, all physicians were required to wash their hands in a solution of chloride of lime before examining a laboring woman, and after a year of this practice, not a single death from childbed fever occurred among mothers in the first division. But European doctors regarded Semmelweis's discovery with hostility, for they could not believe it was their own hands that had spread disease, nor did they recognize that Semmelweis had uncovered an even more important fact. Midwives, whose traditional role was to assist and not interfere with the birthing process, had historically attended pregnant women with greater success than had physicians. So it was not until several years later that physicians did listen to Joseph Lister, whose techniques of antisepsis in surgery were new enough and unthreatening enough to bring about the gradual emergence of the modern hospital as we recognize today. More than half a century was to pass before childbed fever was brought under control. However, and even by 1929, over 40% of maternal deaths in the United States were attributed to this disease. Today, the cure of childbed fever is considered a breakthrough discovery in the field of obstetrics, but like other breakthroughs in childbirth, it only served to resolve a specific problem at a specific time. It did not affect the deep-rooted attitudes and problems relating to childbirth that had been developing since the advent of Christianity and which had linked birth with disease and disorder for at least 18 centuries. So it was not long before birthing women began to believe that only a doctor and only a hospital could prevent such diseases from occurring. Women began to turn away from the midwife and bring her fears, her expectation of pain, and her distrust of her own body directly to the male physician. Gradually but willingly, then, she gave up her responsibility in the birth process to those who professed to know more about it than she did. This step-by-step loss of responsibility was a side effect of every breakthrough in obstetrical science, including the invention of forceps in 1588. By this time, childbirth had become so wretched and torturous for birthing women, and labor had become so lengthy and difficult that even the patience and constant attention of the midwife was not enough to support women through her travail. Although male midwives were at first considered heretics, then something of a joke among European societies and something of a threat to midwives, men did enter the field of childbirth. Opportunists recognized a chance to save women from the curse of their bodies and possibly get rich in the process. I've heard these stories before, and maybe one day I'll do a research project and write a book and try to track down the validity of all these stories. I'm sure some of it's true. So in 1588, I was under the impression that in America, even in the 1800s, maybe 1800s, that most children were born at home with a midwife. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I thought it was, at least in America, the medical profession that tried to take the money away from the midwives just because they could. But we'll see if she talks anything about that. One such opportunist was Peter Chamberlain, who designed the first forceps but kept the secret of his invention within his family for 3 generations. A woman in difficult labor who could locate Chamberlain and afford his fee would never see the contraption he carried in a locked box to her bedside. Working under the sheet that extended from the woman's neck to his own, Chamberlain would open the hidden box and pull out the metal pieces, which would clank together in such a mysterious fashion that women held him in awe, believing he was employing a form of iron hands. And again, it was women who could afford his fee, so likely this was the more well-to-do women. I doubt that in the countryside the poor women were doing this sort of thing, and that was my understanding, is that was the well-to-do, wealthy women that started the trend of going to the hospital or going to medical doctors for childbirth. The Chamberlain brothers' sons and nephews carried on the secret, attempted to organize and teach the midwives who rebelled against them, flaunted their secret power of saving, quote-unquote, women from the throes of childbirth, and tried to sell the secret design of their instrument for what would be today a price of $7,500. And this book was written in the 70s, so that would probably be about 7 or 8 times that. So $50,000. Eventually, the design of the invention leaked out, but by that time, the wonder and mystery of forceps had become so legendary that doctors used the device on all but the speediest births, often harming rather than helping the process by their lack of training. Nevertheless, the awe and respect once granted the natural process was now given over to the doctor instead, and after centuries of neglect, birthing women were grateful for what seemed to be a new and advanced scientific technique. Although forceps delivery was excruciatingly painful, conducted then without anesthesia, it made the birth process faster and seemingly safer when performed by a physician. Another breakthrough that transferred woman's authority in childbirth to the doctor had occurred a few years earlier when Louis XIV replaced the birthing stool with a flat horizontal table. The king, it seemed, had a royal perversion. He liked to watch his various mistresses giving birth and took great sexual pleasure in hiding behind a nearby curtain. I'm finding this hard to believe, but I'm sure this may have happened, but how much does this really play into the overarching history of things? This is incredible. When the woman sat on the birthing stool, he could see little, especially as she was dressed to her toes and her genitals were hidden from view by the extended sheet. So Louis called in a male physician who gently convinced the ladies of court that childbirth would be easier and simpler if they reclined on a high table. Of course, the supine position was easier for him, as it gave him a closer view and better leverage in delivery, and it was better for Louis, who could see everything he wanted to see, but it was disastrous for women, who no longer had the force of gravity working to her advantage and labored longer and harder in an effort to push the baby out. Gradually, however, all women of the court and later their lesser counterparts throughout the country copied the royal fashion of lying down at birth so that a male midwife or physician could deliver the baby and, in effect, take care of everything. So again, this is confirming what I had understood, that the royal women and the well-to-do women started the trend, and then the lesser counterparts throughout the country copied the royal fashion. So Very interesting. Then in 1847, Sir James Young Simpson of Edinburgh discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform, which was at first considered a boon to surgery, but a sacrilege when used in childbirth. Ministers, priests, scientists, philosophers, and politicians all took to the podium to defend the Christian belief that women's condition was to suffer in childbirth, and that anything preventing this pain was against God. So if that's true, there ought to be plenty of evidence. I'd like to find those and track down and see if that's actually true. Was there just one or two people doing this, or was this really a widespread thing? Simpson eventually won his fight by convincing Queen Victoria to take chloroform for the birth of her child in 1853. From that time on, the drug was known as anesthesia à la Reine, a fashionable, much sought-after relief from centuries of fear and pain. Victorian woman, even more ashamed of her body than her European sister, received chloroform with immense gratitude, as she could now give birth, the ultimate elemental experience, without having to deal with any of the elements: emotion, sensation, bodily secretions, smells, blood. Floating into euphoria as she reclined on her back on the doctor's table, woman released everything she had: her power, her work, her responsibility, and her baby, to the authority of the physician, who willingly took it all. There is no doubt that the history of childbirth can be viewed as a gradual attempt by man to extricate the process of birth from woman and call it his own. I don't think it's that simple, but whatever. Indeed, some anthropologists and radical feminists believe that man has always been threatened by woman's exclusive power in childbirth, and that by placing his strength and intelligence against her docility and instinct, he, quote-unquote, won an authoritarian role in society. I mean, I guess it's plausible. It is true that from the very beginning it was man who thought he could understand and control nature by using his power to reason, and man who introduced the first unnatural interferences to the birthing process. I'm not sure. It was man who thought he could understand and control nature by using his power to reason. Are you saying that women don't have the power to reason and didn't want to control nature? I'm confused why you're thinking that rests only on man's shoulders. I guess it's just the pendulum swinging the other way, because obviously there's been patriarchal religious things throughout history for quite some time, and now that that has changed, it's the pendulum swinging the other way, and we're going to blame everything on men, just the way that men blamed everything on women. At least the biblical. I'm just thinking of the Adam and Eve, and Eve being the cause of original sin and that sort of nonsense. Disinterested in normal birth, man relegated the lowly art, quote-unquote, of birth care to the midwife, then attempted to teach the midwife about birth from his own distant observations. As monk, priest, disciple, or physician, man translated his fear of woman into punishment by placing a curse on her body. It was man who moved in on normal birth to baptize the baby and mother that he himself may have damaged. This is it's one of those things. It's like, okay, sure, men could only be priests, men could only baptize, but it wasn't the priests who were the doctors. Those were separate groups of people. It's not like they had a meeting in the evenings between the two and said, aha, how are we going to work together to make women's lives worse and take power over them. And it seems to me that the original reasoning in the beginning was that the men were away hunting and that they were separated from the birthing process, and they were confused about it, and in their arrogance and pride they wanted to make up stories about what was happening, and it was all false. I'm not quite getting the point of what she's saying. It's like saying that this house is white, it has white paint on it, and so therefore it's a sign of racism. It's like, it's true, what she's saying is true. Men did these things, but it's a little more complex than just the fact that the Y chromosome naturally does this sort of thing. Especially if we want to get to the underlying cause and fix the underlying cause so that this stops happening, this sort of thing, then we need to know what the actual cause was and not just blame it on the Y chromosome. It's too simplistic of a view. Man placed woman on her back in labor, then devised metal tools to pull her baby out, then knocked her senseless with anesthesia. This is all true. And it was man who, throughout history, did it all in the name of, quote unquote, saving woman from her own body. You know, this is interesting because she earlier said that the priests were lecturing that women were supposed to suffer in childbirth. So which one is it? Did the men want her to suffer, or were the men trying to save her from her own body and relieve her pain? Did it all in the name of saving woman from her own body, from the curse of her gender, from the pain of her travail, and from her own ignorance. Today, the male obstetrician, with his kindly paternalism, comforts woman by advising her to leave everything to him, to simply place herself in his hands and abide by the procedures of his institution, the hospital. And woman, that docile, ignorant, cursed, weak, and dependent victim of deception, willingly agrees. Okay, so is she going to go into why the women willingly agree? Is it just because they've been brainwashed, they've been scared to death, I guess? They've been tricked by the men and scared to death. The other issue, though, this was written in the 70s, and certainly 99% of the obstetricians were men, but today I'm pretty sure that at least 25% of them are women. I don't know the statistics, but whole heck of a lot more of them are women today than they were in the 70s, and guaranteed the women obstetricians are still doing the same things that the men were doing. They are using too much technology that's unneeded and ends up causing the natural process of the birth process to halt and to slow down, which then necessitates them to have a C-section. So it's not just the Y chromosome. I guess you could say that the men brainwashed the women when they went to medical school or something, but come on. The problem's bigger, deeper issue than just the Y chromosome. The purpose of viewing the history of childbirth in this manner is not to assess blame, okay, great, thank you, but simply to recognize how woman has been completely left out of the decisions and turning points in history that have affected her exclusive domain. And it confirms the fact that after centuries of ingrained fear, expectation of pain, and obeisance to male domination, she cannot easily come to childbirth a changed woman after a few classes in natural childbirth or a heavy dose of woman's liberation. What she can do long before labor ever begins is to try to understand her real fears, where they come from, and how they may affect her attitude about bearing children in even the most seemingly insignificant ways. She can inform herself as to the real nature of the childbirth process, what awaits her in the hospital, and whether her choices, rights, and decisions about birth are still within her own reach. If she has already had a child and feels vaguely dissatisfied, guilty, or sensitive about her role in the process, she can at least take some comfort in the knowledge that she is not alone and hasn't been for centuries. And finally, if she realizes that man may control the management of birth but is still separated from the process, she can reclaim her responsibility in birth and educate her mate and doctor as to its real experience. Perhaps the most useful way of viewing the history of childbirth is to see it as a chronicle of interferences in the natural process. I agree with that. That sounds great. Civilization produced living conditions and attitudes that brought a wide variety of problems to birth, then doctors to deal with these problems, then still more doctors to deal with the problems the first doctors had caused. Thank you. In the same way, new forms of hospitalization were needed to correct the errors earlier hospitals had brought to the process. Throughout it all, civilization changed, the role of doctor and midwife changed, and woman herself changed, but the process of normal birth remained as uncomplicated and inherently safe as it had been since the beginning of humankind. Except when the woman is fearful and interfered with by the messed up society. Thus, if we believe today that childbirth is dangerous, risky, painful, and terrifying, it is only because as a race of people we have made it so. If we turn to the doctor and the hospital as the only authorities on childbirth available, it is because we have turned away from the built-in authority of our own bodies. If we believe primitive women had an easier time in childbirth, it is because we have come on, why is this doing this? There we go. Made it complicated and difficult for ourselves. So many centuries have passed since women approached birth with a matter-of-fact acceptance and without fear or expectation of pain that she has now become a total innocent, even more than man, of the very process which has always been exclusively inherently her own. How sad. That will be all